All right, the first result that's important to note is that Likud had which is Netanyahu's party, had a weaker result. They had won fewer votes in the second election than they won in the first election. Okay, Likud plus the party that they merged in, and they actually took in a couple of smaller parties after the last election, had 39 seats. Now they're down to 31. They lost several 100,000 votes, both from people staying away, and a lot of their voters stayed home. And it also seems like Arab turnout was up, so as a percentage, their voters were a smaller percentage. Okay, so this is not what Netanyahu was hoping would happen. He was hoping that he would get a mandate to be able to form a coalition without Lieberman. That is certainly not possible, and in fact is less possible now than it would have been after the last election. Kahol Lavan, which is the coalition, Benny Gantz's coalition, was slightly strengthened.
There's water on the shelf right below your right hand.
Perfect. So Kahol Lavan is slightly strengthened and is more center-right. What I mean by that is some of the voters that went to blue and white last time went back home to the traditional left-wing parties that they went for. So in April, a lot of them tactically voted for blue and white because they were just so sick of Bibi that they were willing to essentially vote for somebody who was not in agreement with them on major core issues just to get rid of Bibi. If you're an American, this probably sounds somewhat familiar because all of us have faced that choice recently, regardless of which party we're in, right? So those tactical voters went home because they were afraid that the left-wing parties were going to fall completely below the threshold. That didn't happen, but blue and white seems to have picked up some voters from the right. They also picked up some Arab voters. So I was listening to a podcast from Haaretz, which is the main newspaper in Israel, and they were talking about how in the most heavily Druze, the Druze are an Arab-Israeli community that belongs to a minority sect of Islam, but in the heavily Druze cities, they voted heavily for blue and white. And that is interesting because they have occasionally voted for Likud in the past. They have also voted sometimes for the Arab nationalist parties, but they went, or the Arab list. They went to blue and white. Okay. The other really interesting result here is that the joint Arab list increased their percentage of the vote. And this is interesting because they are now essentially larger as a percentage of the Knesset than both of the traditional Israeli left-wing parties combined. So Labor and Meretz, which is a party that's further to the left of Labor but still Zionist, won 11 seats. The Joint Arab List got 13. Okay? The problem with the Joint Arab List is that it's a Joint Arab List, so it's a coalition of all of the different Arab parties. So there's some parties that are willing to work within the system. There are other parties that are kind of see the Israeli system as somewhat illegitimate because they feel like it doesn't represent them enough, and some of them have a, let's just say, less than firm commitment to Israel's right to exist. So the Arab nationalist joint list is a huge, huge space in terms of the wide variety of their political views. But the figure to watch here is Ayman Odeh. He is the head of the Arab, I would say the joint Arab list. And he is interesting because more than a lot of Arab leaders in the past, Odeh has shown a willingness to play the Israeli game, to define himself as an Israeli citizen, and to try to work within the structure of Israeli politics. And that's an interesting development if it continues, and if that tends to be the attitude that Arab voters want. And by the way, the splitting of the Arab list and the fact that a lot of the Arab political parties were saying they weren't going to even support Gantz, who was getting rid of Netanyahu, caused a massive drop in Arab turnout because Arab voters were disgusted by that and just completely fed up with it. The fact that the list came back together and Odeh said that he would be more involved and potentially even back a candidate for prime minister led to a spike in Arab turnout. So my inner political scientist is telling me that actually this is probably what Arab voters want. They want to be part of the system. They want to work within the system of Israel to make their lives better. And for the general stability of Israel, that's a good thing. All right, Lieberman and his party, Israel Batenu, which is the ethno-nationalist party, actually jumped. So they went from 5 seats to 9 seats. So if we thought Lieberman was a kingmaker before, he's even more of a kingmaker now. And that means that his joint tactics of, number one, poking Netanyahu in the eye, and number two, running explicitly against the religious parties worked. So if you're in the religious parties, the fact that Lieberman, who was essentially running explicitly against you, almost doubled his number of seats, has to be very alarming. The national religious parties lost a significant number of votes. The ultra-Orthodox gained actually seats in this election. However, they're now in a much weaker position because there are enough people in both Kahal Lavan and Yisrael Beitenu, who are two of the parties that you kind of need to form a coalition, who are not necessarily favorably inclined toward them. So they are in a position now potentially of being shut out of government, which, given the push for secularization, could be disastrous for them. Right? So this is a potential crisis for those two religious nationalist movements. The other group that I would say is in crisis is the left. They will possibly have more influence because they could help Gantz form a coalition. However, they've not increased their seat total and their vote total. And they seem like, at this point, they are just going to be a minor player in Israel moving forward. Maybe they can leverage that into gaining some of what they want. Minor parties have done it effectively before, but it's a huge come down from where they were before the Second Intifada. So real quickly, let me just go through a couple of possible outcomes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Right? So the first possible outcome is what Avigdor Lieberman essentially said that he wanted when he started this election, which is a national unity government between blue and white, Likud, and Yisrael Beitenu. This would be a broadly right-to-center-right government. It would not be explicitly tied to the religious parties. It could potentially pursue some of what Lieberman wants in terms of secularization. And it would have a lot of seats. So Kahal Lavan has 33, Netanyahu has 31, Yisrael Beitenu has 9. So this is a stable government that could actually govern comfortably for most of its term. Because again, if the government does not have a majority, can no longer command the majority, you have a vote of no confidence, which means you have another election. Right? So this would be a stable government. The hang-up here is Netanyahu. Right? Gantz and Blue and White have basically said we will not go into any unity government with Netanyahu. They want a unity government in which Likud ditches Netanyahu. Netanyahu, of course, does not want that. One scenario that some people have floated is what's essentially called the Nixon Option. This is that Netanyahu resigns and gets an immunity deal. Essentially, he resigned and he is pardoned by whoever becomes the next prime minister for any indictments that may come down on him or his family. Right, so that's a possibility. That is certainly something that could happen. Netanyahu's folks have said, we are absolutely not willing to do this. To me, that sounds like an opening negotiating bid, because if it's a choice between that or having a third election, which we'll talk about why that might be bad for him in a second, or going to jail, I think he probably is enough of a pragmatist to take that option and live to fight another day. So that is one possible option. The other possible option is that you could try to see a coalition of the left or the right. The problem is the math doesn't add up. And the reason the math doesn't add up for either side is Avigdor Lieberman. Okay? If you remember earlier, I said there are two groups that he really doesn't like: Arab Israelis and the religious parties. Okay? The left coalition, which would actually not be that far left because it would mean blue and white in charge and they're really a center-right party, but sort of the center to center-left coalition, would have to rely on the votes of the Joint Arab List. They would have to, at a minimum, provide supply, which means we're not going to be in government, but we will vote to uphold the government on what are called confidence measures, measures that require a majority to pass. Lieberman has said he won't work with them. On the right, Netanyahu certainly can't go into an exclusively right-wing government without the ultra-Orthodox and the religious nationalists. Lieberman has also said he won't work with them. So Lieberman has the balance of power, and he won't work with either of the groups that would make it possible for the left or the right to govern on their own. So what does that leave? If it's not this Lieberman option, this coalition that Lieberman wants, we're probably looking at Israeli elections round 3 if we can't form a government. It's a very realistic possibility, but there are a couple of reasons why nobody wants it. First of all, at a certain point, the voters are just going to get annoyed and not show up. Second of all, Bibi Netanyahu's coalition lost significant support from the first election to the second election. And as much as he's going to try to blame it on Lieberman, Gantz, the Arabs, and just about anybody else, the Israeli voters, if they're tired of the political process, just inevitably, if you're frustrated with politics, you're going to take it out on the incumbent. Right? So chances that Bibi loses more support in the third election are pretty high. Finally, there have been a lot of concerns about the idea of sort of Israel's democracy. And so a third election would I think maybe potentially undermine that and bring that issue more to the forefront. Nevertheless, it is a distinct possibility. And if that happens, we'll have to decide whether we're going to do one of these again. So I will just give you a couple of quick broad implications of this. Number one, the unresolved issue of what it means to be a Jew is going to vex Israeli politics until it is resolved. So Israel's national identity itself is very ambivalent and not fixed. And there are competing nationalisms on the Israeli right, and that's going to continue to divide Israeli politics. The second implication, the Arabs have an opportunity. They have a chance to play an unprecedented role as Arab parties explicitly. There have been Arab cabinet ministers, but Arab parties have never been in government before. So they've got an unprecedented role, a chance to play a role. And that in and of itself would have implications for Israel's national identity and would complicate things for everyone. However, there are both dangers and difficulties that remain. The Arab parties are very disunited. They have a complex relationship both with Israel's government and with the various Palestinian groups in the West Bank and Gaza. And so there's an opportunity, but there's also potentially a lot of risk. After all, demagoguery against the Arab parties and sort of opposition to the Arab parties, kind of like opposition to different religious groups on the left and the right, or even different political groups on the left and the right here, is always a vote winner among certain segments of the population. Right? So they have an opportunity, they need to be careful. The third implication is that Bibi's time may be running out. This is probably the grimmest situation Netanyahu has faced in his political career. However, one thing that we can say about Netanyahu is that he is a survivor, and so he can't entirely be counted out. The final implication, I would say, and this is the one that's the most US-centric, I don't expect any major changes in terms of the US relationship with Israel. I don't expect any major changes in terms of Israel's strategic position. And I certainly don't anticipate, for example, that a new government that comes into power is going to somehow be have a dramatically worse relationship with President Trump, or a dramatically different relationship with a different American president if Trump loses in 2020. However, there is one thing to be a little bit cautious about, and that is this. We know that President Trump, in terms of foreign policy, tends to be very personalistic. What I mean by that is his personal relationships that he has with foreign leaders are very important, and that is a way and a means by which he does foreign policy. Netanyahu has really played on that in electoral terms in Israel. Essentially, he's kind of claimed to be the Trump whisperer. Netanyahu's American presence, I'm sure you are all aware of this, he speaks impeccable English. He's very, very well educated, and the persona that he's crafted in the United States is incredibly popular. Benny Gantz certainly has a compelling background as a former general in the IDF, but his English is not quite as good, he's not quite as dynamic, and it's possible that he might not quite have the same personal relationship with Trump. Where this comes into play is that Trump's other BFF in the Middle East is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. And MBS really wants Trump to come out with a peace plan so that MBS can essentially argue that he is now the Trump whisperer and he's looking out for the Arab Street. And so everybody should just ignore what's happening in Yemen and really take the hard anti-Iranian line that he wants. Trump may, if Netanyahu is not there, feel more pressure to come out with a peace plan, and he may also think that as the ultimate deal maker, solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 2020, right before an election, will guarantee him both re-election and, as he said he wanted this morning, a Nobel Prize. So would that be a dramatic change? It's hard to say, but it is certainly a possibility worth watching if Netanyahu is no longer prime minister.